this hall was on February 28th of 2020, almost exactly 18 months ago. It happened that that lecture was a lecture by one of our alumni as well, Christine Caldwell Ames. And that was the last time we were able to assemble in this room. So I'm very pleased to see you all and to see you as well, or to imagine you who are following us on the YouTube channel. It's been a very, very long time. I'm delighted to introduce the first of our 75th anniversary lecture series speakers. We are bringing in 4 alumni, and our first speaker is one of them. Professor Leslie Lockett received her bachelor's degree at Amherst, and I've always loved this. Her degree was in medieval studies and biology. If we have any undergraduates here, that is really cool, and we have undergraduates doing exactly that kind of thing, and it's I think led to interesting things in Leslie's career. She did her Ph.D. here at the Medieval Institute, co-directed by Michael Lappage and Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe. She is now associate professor and associate director of OSU's Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, which does all kinds of cool stuff. I know their former director pretty well, and I'm anxious to talk to her about the kind of events they're doing. Dr. Lockett specializes in Old English, medieval Latin, and early medieval intellectual history, and also in the history of cheese making, and that's where biology comes back into her career. Her first book, which was entitled Anglo-Saxon Psychologies in the Vernacular and Latin Traditions, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2011, won not one but 2 major prizes, the Israel Golantz Prize of the British Academy, as well as the John Nicholas Brown Prize for a first book by the Medieval Academy of America. She's currently working on an edition and translation and a lengthy study of the Old English version of Augustine's Soliloquies, and you'll be able to suss out from her lecture title, Early Medieval Readers in Dialogue with Augustine's Soliloquia. I've been around medieval Latin for too long, I can't pronounce it. Soliloquia. I think that did it, right? Yeah, that was the right way. So she'll be speaking to us then on a work that she is currently doing, and please join me in welcoming her as our first speaker in the Medieval Institute in 18 months.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you to Tom and also to Tim Mahan, who was, I think, on interim director duty last year when the invitation came about, and to Dr. Megan Hall. I know a lot of organization has gone into the series and into the technology, and I'm very grateful to be here in person and grateful for everyone making things as safe as possible. And I also now want you to say a little prayer for me, as I have to say the word Soliloquia like 100 times in the next 50 minutes. So it's interesting to think about how we now gauge which works of Augustine of Hippo are important to us. You may be familiar with the sort of soap opera version of Augustine's Confessions that came out in Italy and then was marketed in the US as well almost a decade ago. I haven't yet watched Restless Heart, which is hard to believe because I actually have the DVDs. I think I've just been like waiting for the right company to watch it in. It's funny, you know, my girlfriends don't want to come over and watch this for movie night. Surely, now that Restless Heart is nearly a decade old, I hope they're going to do sort of a soap opera version prequel based on Augustine's Soliloquia, right? I mean, it really foreshadows a lot of things in the Confessions. I'm kidding. And I'm not surprised that there's not a big, pop culture response to the Soliloquia, because present-day readers think of the Soliloquia as one of Augustine's minor works. I've also seen it described in print as peripheral and esoteric. So it's understandable if you are wondering why I've chosen to study and to discuss today the responses of early medieval readers to this minor work of Augustine. Initially, my study was motivated by the fact that an anonymous scholar working in southern England around the year 900 had the good sense to translate Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Old English, and also decided to make an Old English adaptation of Augustine's Soliloquia. It's tough to understand why he would have chosen this, of all of Augustine's texts, to put into Old English. Other scholars who've tackled this question tend to foreground the translator's major changes and additions to the text, supposing that they can deduce what was really important to the translator based on the parts of the Old English version that are the most innovative. But this seems completely backwards to me. If you want to know why somebody turned a Latin work into Old English, first figure out what they gained from their study of the Latin work. And perhaps the best evidence for why a given Latin work was studied lies in the scribal and readerly treatments of that work in its surviving manuscripts. Accordingly, I am about to lead us on a tour of the paratexts that were applied to Augustine's Soliloquia in the early Middle Ages, from construal marks and lexical glosses to incipits and explanatory notes. The endpoint of today's talk is not actually to solve this mystery of why there is an Old English soliloquies at all, but rather to arrive at a more complete and more complex understanding of what early medieval readers aimed to accomplish when they studied the Soliloquia. I'll turn this off for a minute while I give you some background on the dialogue itself, since the paratexts will make more sense if we're familiar with the text that they're applied to. We know from Augustine's Confessions that in the summer of 386, Augustine was living in Milan. He was not yet a baptized Christian, and one day he was caught up in an intensely emotional struggle over whether he would finally convert to Christianity and give up all the bodily pleasures that were incompatible with the life of a Christian intellectual as he saw it. Rushing into the garden, he heard a voice calling "Tolle lege," take and read. Augustine picked up the Pauline epistles, and his eye fell on Romans 13, in which Paul exhorts his readers to renounce eroticism and indecencies, and to make no provision for the flesh in its lusts. In the Confessions, Augustine relates, "I neither wished nor needed to read further. All shadows of doubt were dispelled. He was ready to commit himself to celibacy and to Christianity, and he retreated to a friend's country estate at Cassiciacum, where he studied philosophy and prepared for baptism at Easter 387. During this interval, in the wake of this wrenching conversion experience, Augustine wrote the Cassiciacum dialogues as well as the Soliloquia, and even though its title means speaking alone, it is a philosophical dialogue. The two interlocutors are a semi-autobiographical figure called Augustine, and the other is called Ratio. It's a personification of Augustine's own faculty of reason, so in that sense, he is really talking to himself. At the start of Book 1 of the dialogue, the interlocutor Augustine offers a long prayer of praise and supplication addressed to each person of the Trinity in turn. And then he affirms that of all the things he might like to know, the two most crucial are God and the soul. Specifically, the question of the soul's immortality is what will propel most of the dialogue from this point forward. So I've spent the day inside an N95, so I'm grateful for the water here. In Book 1, Ratzinger steers Augustine through a consideration of how different objects of knowledge are apprehended by different types of perception and knowledge. Looking at a spherical object with your eyes is not the same as contemplating an ideal sphere in the study of geometry, and neither of these forms of knowing can fully apprehend God. To draw closer to the vision of God in this life requires the cultivation of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, as well as ascetic discipline, which the interlocutor Augustine had been practicing since he read Cicero's Hortensius at age 18, so he tells Ratio. For this reason, he now, at age 33, rejects sensual pleasures, including marriage and the fathering of children, which would distract him from the pursuit of wisdom. There are some desires that Augustine has not quashed, for bodily health, for his friends, for life itself. But Ratio helps him to see that he doesn't desire these things per se, but rather because he believes that he can pursue wisdom better when he has these things than if he doesn't have them. After an overnight pause in the conversation, Ratio gives Augustine some bad news. Augustine supposes he's made a lot of progress in renouncing these bodily desires, but he's actually only succeeded in giving stuff up for a while. The desires are still in him and flourishing. Augustine is crushed, and so Ratio, he tells her, quit making him so miserable, basically, and she changes her tactics completely and makes it less personal, turns to a discussion of truth. Is truth different from the true? Is it immortal? If it exists, where does it exist? This is a difficult question, since where implies a place, and only a body can exist in a place, and truth is not a body. And because truth abides even when true things pass away, the only true things that can properly be said to exist are immortal. Here Book 1 ends. At the start of Book 2, Ratio argues that if truth cannot die, then neither can the mind, because the mind is where immortal truth exists. But Ratio's argument doesn't hold up, because truth could theoretically be housed in a series of minds that die off and are replaced. They back up and start again, now considering the relationship between falsity and subjective perception, distinguishing between what is merely false and what deceives purposefully. Can something be true and false at the same time, like lead is false silver but true lead? Does falsity consist in simply appearing to be what it is not? And does truth consist in nothing more than actually being what something appears to be? This is pretty much how all of Book 2 progresses till close to the end, about these different types of truth and falsity, trying to narrow in on an answer that will let Ratio support a demonstration of the soul's immortality. Eventually, they turn back to a discussion of truth of the sort contained in the disciplines, such as grammar or geometry. Disciplines exist inseparably in the mind. And according to the terminology of the Aristotelian categories, a discipline is in the mind as in a subject, in subjecto. As Ratio spells it out, and I'll read the translation, something is said to be in something else in two ways. In the first way, such that it can be separated and exist somewhere else, such as this piece of wood in this place, or the sun in the east. And in the second way, as in a subject, so that it cannot be separated from it, such as the shape and appearance that we see in this piece of wood, or light in the sun, or heat in fire, or a discipline in the mind. If anything that is in a subject persists forever, and here I'm reading the translation of the second part of the Latin that's on the screen, it must be that the subject itself also persists forever, and every discipline is in the mind as in a subject. Therefore, if the discipline persists forever, it must be that the mind persists forever. Now, Augustine accepts the notion of existence in subjecto, but he objects to the idea that in subjecto is how disciplines exist in the mind. I do not see, Augustine says, how a discipline exists forever in the mind, least of all the discipline of disputation, when so few people are experts in it. And anyone who does know it will have spent such a long time stretching back to infancy without having learned it. Ratio actually isn't going to clear this up before Book 2 ends. She talks with Augustine about how bodies can be true, but not in the same way as disciplines, how if the body had a true form, it would be a mind. Ratio even adduces very briefly what sounds like the concept of anamnesis, the idea that learning involves no new information, but is simply the recollection of truths that the soul absorbed during a period of existence prior to its embodiment, although the author, Augustine, would later state in his retractations that's not what he meant to say at all, but medieval readers tended to understand it that way. In the end, Ratio promises a third book in which she will strengthen her proof of the soul's immortality. But Augustine never completed this third book, and Book 2 ends on a really dark note, with Augustine expressing fear that even if the soul is immortal, its existence after the body's death might be hideously impersonal and unconscious, like the life of a child in utero. Now, previous scholarship on the early medieval reception of the Soliloquia has focused almost exclusively on Carolingian scholars who borrowed from this work as they crafted their own theological treatises. In particular, the group of Alcuin's associates who authored the Munich Passages, John Scotus Eriugena, and Rather of Verona. I know of only one published study that approaches reception of the Soliloquia by way of the surviving manuscript witnesses, and that is contained in a few pages of David Pratt's 2007 monograph, The Political Thought of King Alfred the Great. This because the Old English soliloquies has long been attributed to Alfred, even though that's been challenged recently. The only other study I'm aware of is not a published study. Dr. Catherine Lefort completed a doctoral thesis on the reception and the text of the Soliloquia in early medieval manuscripts at the Sorbonne in 2010, but her study is not accessible to readers, and she has not yet published any of her findings about the earliest manuscripts of the Soliloquia. Pratt deserves considerable credit for correcting the misapprehension that the Soliloquia was a rare text in the early Middle Ages. As he points out, there survived 13 manuscript witnesses of the Soliloquia that were copied before or around 900, which is almost as many as the 17 manuscripts of Boethius's Consolation that survived from before or around 900. However, I part ways with Pratt where he claims that scribal treatments of the Soliloquia differed sharply from those of the Consolation, the latter of which attracted abundant glosses and commentary as the 9th century progressed. And Pratt writes, though widely known, Augustine's text seems to have supplied only specialized uses in Carolingian learning. The Soliloquia matched many aspects of Carolingian educational theory, but it offered limited potential for practical instruction. Unlike the Consolatio, the dialogue never acquired status as a textbook and received only occasional glossing in the manuscript record. Contemporary additions to London British Library Additional 43460, late 8th century Northern Italy, merely denote passages of interest with brief words of summary. Contemporary Old Irish and Latin glosses to Karlsruhe Landesbibliothek, Augperg 195, Soissons-Orléans, mid-9th century, record the brief clarifications of an Irish reader willing to grapple with Book 2. Please indulge me while I quote from Pratt just a little more. He continues, 9th century manuscripts are otherwise bare. Citations indicate the text's principal value as a philosophical tour de force in esoteric aspects of enquiry. The Soliloquia found notable deployment in the Munich Passages, a collection of philosophical material associated with Alcuin and his circle at Charlemagne's court. Such a use followed a trend in the philosophical reading of Augustine. The Soliloquia's value lay in the complex reasoning of Book 2, supplying the argument that truth can never perish. Thank you for indulging a very long quote. Like I said, this is the only published study of this topic that I'm on today. And my objective today is not to deliver a takedown of Pratt's research at all, but I worry that at moments it's going to seem that way because the manuscript evidence challenges almost every point that I've just quoted. On our tour of the earliest Soliloquia manuscripts, I think we'll learn the following points. 1, paratexts in these manuscripts do not pertain solely to esoteric philosophical inquiry, but demonstrate interest in several different disciplines and cater to students who are still developing their Latin reading skills, as well as more advanced scholars. 2, the annotations in Karlsruhe 195 are neither brief nor are they restricted to Book 2 of the Soliloquia. 3, several surviving 9th century manuscripts other than Karlsruhe 195 transmit less abundant but still valuable annotations. 4, annotation of the Soliloquia slowed but did not stop in the 10th and 11th centuries. And 5, Pratt was only looking for visibly paratextual annotations, that is, the ones that were in interlinear or marginal positions in the surviving manuscripts. But careful study reveals that many of the earliest manuscripts contain interpolated paratexts, glosses, explanatory notes, section titles, and so forth, that have been mistakenly copied into the main text, which means that the antecedents of those manuscripts contain such additions in interlinear and marginal positions. So glossing of the Soliloquia definitely was more widespread than Pratt reckoned. With this roadmap in front of us, let's embark on our tour of the manuscripts themselves, starting with the earliest surviving complete copy of the Soliloquia, which is assigned the siglum B. This is British Library, additional manuscript 43460, late 8th century from northern Italy, where Pratt states that the annotations in B merely denote passages of interest with brief words of summary. I guess this is accurate enough, but I don't like his choice of the word merely. This is the earliest surviving copy of this dialogue and our best window into what readers thought the text was useful for prior to its appropriation into the Carolingian study of dialectic. 11 marginal annotations in B are laid out in a distinctive vertical style that's been compared to a cluster of grapes. Adjacent to the section of the Soliloquia, where Ratio is teaching Augustine about how faith, hope, and love are related to three different actions of the eyes of the mind, the note reads, "What looking is, what seeing is." The further notes on this section, I'm just continuing, these are very close together in the manuscript. Which three things are necessary in this life? That is faith, hope, and love. And here is discussed which three things are in God based on the illumination of the sun. This will sound obscure unless you realize that in the text, Ratio is teaching that the sun exists, shines, and illuminates things, and this is analogous to how God exists, is grasped by the faculty of intellectus, and causes other things to be grasped by the intellectus. The originator of these notes is responding to analogies that are clever on the literary level and also instructive on the theological level. But the next several notes in B share an altogether different concern. Where the interlocutors discuss the kind of ascetic restraint that Augustine already practices, the annotator writes, here he says that he doesn't have any interest in foods. And then Ratio grills Augustine about whether he's actually extinguished these desires. And the annotation here is not completely legible, but it says, it has been shown forcefully that something illegible must be spurned. Going back to the typed out version, Augustine talks about how his recent toothache has been so distracting that he can't learn anything new, and the annotator writes, here he says that he suffered from pain of the teeth. And where Augustine quotes a teaching of the medical author Cornelius Celsus, the annotator sums it up, wisdom is the supreme good, pain is the supreme evil. It's a strange set of takeaways from this supposedly esoteric philosophical dialogue. Marginal comments in this section suggest that readers were really drawn in by Augustine's all too human struggle with the body, both in pain and in pleasure. The next note in B appears alongside one of Augustine's two very brief prayers in Book 2. The annotator calls it Oratio Animae, Prayer of the Soul. And in the remainder of Book 2, there's three more marginal notes, none of which is attached to deeply philosophical material or arguments about truth and falsity. There's one that reads, concerning the reflection that is seen in the mirror. Ratio and Augustine talk about how crocodiles are the only known animals that chew by moving their upper jaw rather than their lower jaw. This is because Ratio wants to make the case that it is possible for something to be the only natural representative of a particular category. The annotator writes ungrammatically, concerning the crocodile, de crocodilum. And lastly, Ratio observes that poets and actors are mensientes, liars, but they don't intend to deceive, whereas someone who has an appetite for deception is called phallax, deceitful. And here the annotator's interest was evidently the lexical distinction between liars and deceivers. His marginal note reads, he who lies on purpose is rightly called deceitful. But the annotations in B are hardly those of a philosopher who's engaging with this text on a level that's accessible to only a few specialized readers. His notes mark out passages of general interest, Augustine's conceptual metaphors, moralizing content about resisting sensual temptations, a concise prayer, and a few fun factoids, the mirror, the crocodile, the word phallax. So the idea that the Soliloquia is just for philosophers isn't backed up at least by our earliest surviving witness, again, late 8th century. The next manuscript on our agenda is the one that Pratt considers his best evidence that the primary audience of the Soliloquia in the 9th century were elite scholars of philosophy. This is manuscript J, Karlsruhe Badische Landesbibliothek, Augiensis Pergamentum 195, copied in the mid-9th century in northeastern Francia. we can get a sense of how complex J's annotations are if we zoom in on just a portion of the second column of 5 recto. You can see, among other things, brief explanatory glosses, sensus pro oculo, id est per deum, id est mens ratio intelligentsia vel scientia, all of these little marginal additions here, some of which they're not all in the same ink or the same hand. There's a suppletive gloss where the direct object of inlustrat is only implied, so the glossator supplies id est disciplinas, that is, what God sheds light on is the disciplines. You can see the marginal L for lege, which functioned like a nota mark but was used more by Irish scribes. And you can see construal marks, that is, symbols that clarify syntactic relationships. There's at least 3 different sort of systems of doing this here. In the column on the left, you see identical symbols above se and demonstraturum because the participle is modifying that pronoun. Sorry, demonstraturam, this is referring to reason. A different sort of construal mark appears over here with opus est because there are 3 separate ut clauses that are marked with identical symbols to show that they are clauses in a list in parallel structure, not in a hypotaxis to one another. And I can zoom in on the last one. We've got these tiny letters written above words to show that if you rearrange them in that order, it'll help you to see the syntax in a more natural order. Throughout manuscript J, construal marks clarify syntactical relationships that, in my subjective opinion, would be pretty obvious to any experienced reader of Latin. And I don't really know what 9th century reader could cope with the content of the Soliloquia, but couldn't grasp that qui is the subject of ostendis in God, you who show to a few people, and so on, or that nulla modifies dissonantia in a construction like God, from whom there is no deviation. The same can be said of lots of the lexical and suppletive glosses in J. Some of them respond to genuinely difficult vocabulary and syntax, and others explain lemata that seem as though only an elementary or middling reader of Latin would really need them. This batch of glosses treats some fairly unusual words, faxit, peditemptum, merile. And here we've got glosses on words that themselves are familiar but have a very specific meaning and context. These would be helpful for lots of readers. For instance, learning that accipe doesn't mean receive, but hear, like hear with your ears, or that in subjecto is used in its technical sense of inseparably. But on the other hand, a surprising number of J's glosses would, I think, be really superfluous for a more learned readership. Does a scholar of philosophy really need help to know that the phrase temere concedas means you agree carelessly, or to know that simile and par are synonyms, or that literata, lettered, implies educated? J also transmits numerous suppletive glosses. These supply syntactical information that is only implied where the Latin prose is compact. For example, this first suppletive gloss clarifies that the antecedent of the pronoun eo is the syllogism that Ratio and Augustine have just worked through. And this is an interesting example because the word syllogismus doesn't actually appear in the Latin. The second one here shows that the implied object of the preposition ab is plumis, feathers, and this prevents the reader from mistaking the is ending on genitive anseris of the goose for an ablative plural instead. But many of J's suppletive glosses cater to an audience with less facility with Latin. In this example, both parts of the if-then construction end with an indirect statement. Since the infinitive is present in the first clause, nos semper victuros esse, it's elided in the second, semper futuros. What sort of reader really needs the clarification of the second esse? And I could deduce many more, there's a longer list than this, of suppletive glosses in J that seem to be stating the obvious. J does contain, alongside its many construal marks and many lexical glosses on very easy words, a smaller number of specialized notes germane to several different disciplines. There's some explanatory notes. Morbus is not a bodily disease, but it's a disease of the soul. The most blessed vision is the vision of God. The stones in question are concealed because they're at the bottom of the sea, and so forth. There are interpretive notes that imbue the text with a metaphorical meaning. that may or may not have been intended by Augustine. So where Augustine addresses God through whom we do not cling to the lures and enticements of wicked things, one annotator interprets the lures as wicked thoughts and the enticements as wicked deeds more specifically. And where Ratio teaches there's more than one path by which one can arrive at wisdom, one annotator writing in Old Irish takes this to mean that wisdom can be reached not solely through virginity, but also from repentance and the lawful state of marriage. Surely a reflection of the annotator's own perspective, since the interlocutor Augustine openly claims exactly the opposite. Some of Jay's notes pertain to the quadrivium, talking about things like the spaces between the planets in the rotation of the heavens, or the nature of the circles contained within a sphere. And some of Jay's glosses reflect the characteristic mode of theological argumentation of the 9th century schools, which, as John Marenbaum observes, combined a Platonist ontology with the Aristotelian categories learned from Latin intermediaries. So where Ratio quotes Cicero's assertion that whatever exists, exists somewhere, the annotator elaborates, that is, in any substance, or in anything, or in any place, or in itself, which is how God exists. Now, taken together, these notes in Jay cover the whole spectrum of Carolingian learning, from basic Latin syntax to dialectic and the quadrivium, and Jay was not the only codex to contain such material. Stokes and Strawn, who edited Jay's Old Irish glosses, they did not edit the Latin ones, they posited on linguistic grounds that a portion of the Irish glosses were copied from an earlier codex. Plus, a few of Jay's glosses are also present in a manuscript we're going to discuss in a few minutes, manuscript BR, but Jay was not a direct linear antecedent of BR, which means that some of the annotations shared between these manuscripts were present in their common ancestor. All this is to say that Jay cannot have been as unique in its glossing as Pratt suggests. Among other 9th century copies of the Soliloquia, none has nearly as many verbal annotations or construal marks as Jay, but Pratt was incorrect to state that these manuscripts are all bare of annotation. Among the 9th century codices listed on your handout, only Q, N, and W were not annotated along with or shortly after the copying of the main text. They're on the handout, though, because they preserve glosses that have been interpolated into the main text of the Soliloquia, which I'll treat in the final section of the paper. The other 9th century copies are more lightly annotated than Jay, to be sure, but they can still show us something of what their readers found useful in the Soliloquia. Manuscript G is Leiden Universitätsbibliothek Vossianus Latinus Q129, copied in Francia in the first quarter of the 9th century. We have some things that you seem to find everywhere and not think too hard about them, right? Oratio is very commonly written in the margin where we've got a prayer and a manuscript. I think maybe this is why Pratt says, oh, these manuscripts don't have anything in them. Some of these glosses are banal, but a reader put them there, or a copyist copied them from where a different reader had put them there. So here we've got oratio where the prayer begins and quaestio where the dialogue proper begins to help someone navigate to it quickly. That's the reason why someone would have put it there. Marginal nota marks mark out 3 passages in Book 1. These are about the introduction of the complex metaphor of the eyes of the mind, Ratio's assertion that if you desire thing A only as a means to thing B, then you don't genuinely desire thing A, and 3, Ratio's insistence that Augustine has it backwards. If he thinks he can put off a commitment to asceticism until he knows it will certainly make him happy. Every one of these passages teaches the reader how ascetic practice brings the individual nearer to the vision of God. Within the first of these nota passages, where the eyes of the mind metaphor is elaborated, the margins contain 3 further notes about what reason is, what virtue is, and what the intellectus is. So we can get a sense of what topics were striking their interest. In G, help with syntax is minimal. I count just 2 sets of construal marks and 1 suppletive gloss. Multiple hands also left notes in manuscript H. This is Würzburg Universitätsbibliothek MPTHF 49, copied prior to 838 at Würzburg and Regensburg. In this one, the interlocutor, Augustine's 3 prayers that he says in the course of the Soliloquia, are all marked. by marginal notes, including signals at both the beginning and the end of the long opening prayer. The unusual word defetiscar in the book 2 of the Soliloquia attracts a gloss based on Priscian's institutions. The ancients said fatiscor and fessus, from which are derived defetiscor, defessus, which some people claimed was derived from fateor. So interested in this sort of etymologizing out of Priscian. Readers marked the definition of the true, where the interlocutor Augustine states that the true is that which is actually as it appears to the knower, if he is willing and able to know. And in the margin we see the definition of grammar, where Augustine claims that the discipline of grammar is the guardian and governess of the spoken word. The best annotation in manuscript H, hands down, is this one. The marginal note, quid sint vepe? What vepe are? That's a pretty good question, right? But it was prompted by a scribal error. The main text, if you can see this in the second row here, it should read veros and not vepas. The images I've put in below just show you how similar the low R and the open P could be in an insular minuscule, and that's what led to the mistake in the main text, which another Caroline Hand comes along and eventually corrects, but not before someone left this fabulous note, quid sint vepe. Let's turn next to manuscript C, which is Kassel Universitätsbibliothek, theological manuscript 30 in folio, copied in the first third of the 9th century at Fulda. C presents just one significant annotation. In Book 2, Ratio asks Augustine to ponder whether something that is purely true can be found outside of the disciplines, praeter disciplinas. In the left margin, way down there, and then enlarged in the image on the right, a corrector contemporary with the main scribe has added this note adjacent to the word disciplinas. He says that the disciplines are grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, geometry, music, arithmetic, and astrology. The Greeks call these enkycleia mathemata, the whole circuit of studies. Philosophy itself is adjoined to these, and it is because of philosophy that those disciplines are indispensable, that is, in a propaidutic role. Parts of this note, as you can see, are now invisible because rebinding has put the left side of the page farther down in the gutter, but I'm pretty confident in my reconstruction of the missing letters because this same note has been interpolated into the main text of the Soliloquia in manuscripts F and R. F is Leiden, Voslat Q75, second half of the 9th century, probably Eastern Francia. R is Barcelona, Archivo de la Corona de Aragon, Ripoll 106, a mid-10th century manuscript. In both codices, the entire note has been integrated in slightly different ways right into Augustine's utterance prior to the bit where Ratio talks about true things outside of the disciplines. So in F, Augustine now says, proceed to the things that remain. He says that the disciplines are grammar, etc., etc. And in R, Augustine says, proceed to the remaining disciplines, that is, grammar, and so forth. We don't need to attempt to trace this bit of commentary to a single source. Lots of works known to or produced by Carolingian scholars promote the 7 liberal arts as propaedeutics to philosophy. But it does bear a really close resemblance to the catalog and defense of the liberal arts in Alcuin's Disputatio de Vera Philosophia. And the Greek phrase enkycleia mathemata, in contrast, is exceedingly rare in early medieval Latin, and the question of how it ended up in a note on the Soliloquia demands some further inquiry beyond what I was able to figure out prior to this paper, but it's a good future problem. The enkycleia mathemata gloss is the only significant annotation in manuscript C. Manuscript R we'll come back to shortly because it's a 10th century codex, but let's wrap up manuscript F before we leave it. The only further clues to reader engagement here are a mysterious series of dots arranged systematically in the margins, varying in number and orientation. If any of you know exactly what this means, please don't hesitate to tell me in the Q&A. Evina Steinova, who's one of my go-to sources for figuring out all the Carolingian and Irish marks in the 9th century manuscripts, she doesn't mention anything quite like this. And so I can't say what their significance was beyond that of a general nota symbol. I can report that they appear on 16 of the 23 folios of Book 1, which is the more pastoral, spiritual of the two books, and on only 6 of the 30 folios of Book 2, the more philosophical part of the dialogue. To close out our tour of the 9th century codices, let's look at manuscript K, which is Karlsruhe, Augperg 236, copied at Reichenau in the 2nd quarter of the 9th century. One reader of K marked numerous passages with the trigon symbol, which Steinova identifies as another Irish counterpart to the nota symbol. This reader applied the trigon to 17 different passages, clearly favoring philosophical content. Most of the marked passages are about truth and falsity, how the disciplines are true, and what constitutes existence in subjecto. Even the passages that he marked in Book 1 deal primarily with epistemology, although it's worth mentioning that this reader, with his sophisticated tastes, nonetheless put a trigon next to the one sentence about the crocodile. K contains only 2 annotations that are visibly paratextual. One of these is an abbreviation SEQ for sequitur or sequentia. It appears next to the opening prayer, and I haven't been able to determine why it says sequitur or sequentia in that spot. But I do want to show you this one. It appears adjacent, it's in a Caroline hand that is rather later than the work of the main scribe, I think. It appears adjacent to a passage where Ratio asks Augustine if the geometrical line and sphere are comparable to God as objects of perception. The note reads, specifically, the line is the length of the earth, and the sphere is the orbit of the world. There is nothing in the Soliloquia that warrants this metaphorical interpretation of line and sphere. Ratio and Augustine are speaking quite literally about ideal shapes in geometry. But it's interesting to me because at exactly this point in the corresponding passage of the Old English soliloquies, the speakers conflate geometrical and astronomical shapes as well. Yeshadwisness in the Old English describes the discipline that we call geometry as the one in which you learned about a single line that was written along the middle of the ball. On that ball, you were taught about the position of the 12 constellations and the path of the sun. So this is a connection that I think needs further following up. We don't have a lot of other links between the Old English soliloquies and K. As we'll talk about later, there are much clearer links between the Old English and 2 of our other manuscripts. But this brings us to the end of the 8th and 9th century marginal and interlinear annotations. This is a good moment to clarify that for this study, I've been able to consult either in person or online all the surviving copies from the 8th and 9th centuries except Madrid Real Biblioteca del Escorial S332, a 9th century manuscript of Spanish origins. It's not available online yet. Of course, I haven't been traveling anywhere to see manuscripts. My coverage of 10th and 11th century manuscripts that's coming up, though, is selective rather than exhaustive. Among the later codices on the handout, we can set aside for the moment O, D, A, N, C, H, and Rouen 469 because they transmit only interpolated annotations. Let's start with manuscript BR. This is Brussels KBR, manuscript 8558-63, part 1, copied in southern England or Mercia in the 2nd quarter of the 10th century. There it is. Its few annotations were applied by the main scribe. Some of them are clearly carried over from its exemplar. These include 5 lexical glosses, an explanatory gloss, a suppletive gloss, and 1 set of construal marks. I wish it were more in our English manuscript. Some of the items in this table also appeared in manuscript J, the gloss libera me over the lemma vindicare me. The gloss, oops, I have pictures of these so you can see them back to back. The gloss valde that appears with per multum. The construal marks that show the 3 ut clauses to be items in a list rather than subordinated to one another. Moreover, visibly paratextual additions in J have been interpolated into the main text of BR, such as the synonyma type gloss on Eube, reads id est hortare vel suade, has been interpolated right into the main text in BR. So you've got the main text reading Eube queso atque hortare suade. BR's lexical and syntactic glosses don't tell us all that much about readerly interest in the Soliloquia, especially because most of these glosses come from their exemplar, but it is significant that BR is closely related to J. This affiliation is confirmed by a huge number of shared textual variants in the main text of the Soliloquia, and this matters because, as it turns out, BR and J are the closest relatives of the lost Latin exemplar from which the Old English Soliloquies was translated. I I can't go into this deeply today, time does not permit, and I've got an article coming about this next year in Journal of Medieval Latin, so I'm not going to talk any more about that, but I'm happy to take questions about it in the Q&A. For the purposes of this paper, I'll just note that if we want to know why someone made the Old English translation around 900, we have to consider the possibility that the translator and his colleagues first studied the Soliloquia in a manuscript that looked like J, with copious annotations over a range of subjects, and think about how that might have shaped their perspective on what the dialogue was for. That would have been different if they were reading it out of a manuscript that looked like BR, with very few linguistic annotations, where the Soliloquia is sandwiched between Crodegong's rule for canons and a homily on the purgatorial fire. Our next manuscript is T, Trierstadt Bibliothek 149. The codex itself is actually 9th century, but all of its annotations date to the years 934 to 936, when it came into the hands of Rothair, Bishop of Verona, while he was imprisoned at Pavia after clashing with Hugo of Italy. Rothair studied and annotated all of the texts in manuscript T while preparing to compose a treatise about how people in different occupations and social classes might live as an atleta Christi, a champion of Christ. And he entitled his treatise Preloquia, a riff on Soliloquia. Rothair annotated manuscript T in pale gray ink that has succumbed to fading and wear to the point where they don't all show up well in digitized images. So my remarks are based mostly on Dolbeau's edition of Rothair's notes. Among all the works in manuscript T, Rothair most densely annotated the first book of Augustine's Soliloquia. Dolbeau itemizes 95 notes on book 1, but only 11 that Rothair applied to book 2. Here we get a glimpse of how Rothair worked. Oops, where's that? This one. Adjacent to book 1, chapters 2.7 to 5.11, he laid down 17 numbered summary statements. In the picture on the left, you can see numbers 11, 12, and 13. And then he wove these together into a synopsis of that entire bit of book 1 that's in the margins of the image on the right. And in a subsequent stage of study, he put down yet another layer of notes. These are the paler gray ones in the image on the left. Rothair also composed a pastiche of excerpts from Augustine's opening prayer, sometimes adjusting the diction to make the supplicant's voice more abject and more needy. These verbs down here have been changed from indicatives in the main text to subjunctive in Rothair's version. This may have been reflecting Rothair's own mental state. He was in exile and in prison while annotating this manuscript. At the end of Augustine's opening prayer, Rothair has written between the lines, Hic habenda memoria regis. Here we must be mindful of the king, which Dolbeau takes to be a reminder to think about King Hugo, who imprisoned him. Rothair's notes suggest that he wasn't just dryly analyzing Augustine's prayer, but emotionally inhabiting it. Not all of Rothair's notes are so personal. He adds suppletive and explanatory glosses. A few times he identifies a particular turn of phrase as a Terensian usage or an ancient usage. And he likes to reproduce unusual words and memorable passages in the margins, most of which he would then recycle in his Preloquia. One passage that he copied in the margin but didn't find a place to reuse in the Preloquia is this totally unsavory aphorism that Augustine borrows from Cicero. All fools are insane in the same way that all excrement smells bad. That is, not constantly, but stir it up and you'll smell it. Elsewhere, Rothair's notes show him paying close attention to Augustine's complex metaphors, like God as the divine physician, the eyes of the mind. He also liked to engage with Augustine's tripartite images, so where the interlocutor Augustine states that he will never desire, pursue, or take a wife, Rothair adds to desire in thought, to pursue in speech, to take in deed. Unlike most annotators of the Soliloquia, Rothair was willing to dig into the difficult problem of where something incorporeal can exist. So he copied assertions such as, nothing exists in a place except for a body, and adjacent to the statement, non est nusquam, it does not exist nowhere, Rothair clarifies, that is, it is not held in a place. And yet, among Rothair's scholarly annotations, there persists this plaintive and fearful voice of someone who was imprisoned and who craved guidance that might help him be a better Christian. Rothair acknowledges with humility that, quote, in the present life, nobody progresses so much that there's no source from which he might continually improve. He quotes Gregory the Great when he writes, indeed, any good work is begun in vain if it is abandoned before it is finished. And he uses Augustine's words to remind himself that riches are not to be craved. He paraphrases Leo the Great in a note that says, clearly, where there is not progress, we must fear that there is failure. This is kind of dire. Where the interlocutor Augustine fears that his sensual desires will come back to haunt him, Rothair writes, notandum et timendum, we must take note and be afraid. And where Ratio advises Augustine, that is, believe with constancy in God and commit yourself wholly to him, Rothair writes, good advice. Overall, Rothair's notes show that he was competent to deal with the abstruse philosophical content, but he still lavished far more attention on its devotional and pastoral content. And he found the persona of Augustine in this dialogue to be, if I can use the dreaded R word, relatable. Rothair was not alone in his identification with Augustine's spiritual struggles. We met Codex R earlier because it's got that Encuclia Mathemata gloss interpolated into the main text. R is a 10th century manuscript from the monastery of Santa Maria de Ripoll in the southern foothills of the Pyrenees. So it's in a border region that still lay at this time within the southwestern boundary of the political and intellectual networks of the Carolingians. Paratexts added by one corrector in particular exhibit odd spelling and intractably problematic syntax. I've worked with manuscript R only in medium resolution online images, and I concede that consulting this book in person might allow me to make sense of some of the cramped letter forms and linguistic infelicities that I haven't been able to work out entirely yet, and that I blame on this corrector in the discussion that follows. Most of manuscript R's marginal annotations are punchy little pieces of advice, often including these singular imperative verbs like empty yourself from wretched cares in your leisure time by means of spiritual reading if you desire to make good progress, and flee from deception, and this is to be dreaded by spiritual people. Even where the Latin is pretty intractable, we can still discern this reader's style and his taste for self-help. Explanation. If you misuse, I have no idea, it says abuens, I don't think that makes sense in context. I'm trying to figure out what might have been meant. I'm going with abutens for now. If you misuse the faculty of reason here and you rise by means of spiritual reason to the consummation of the soul's expansion, nevertheless, you will be maybe free from wretched cares. We would just wish for a few more words in the Latin. I know at times we all wish there were more words in the Latin to help us figure out what it means, but there's some serious problems here. Here's another one. Focus your attention, and wondrously you will find that when you rein in your intellectus, it will have become emptied out. You will have been increased by your wretched circumstances. And please forgive my rather groping translations. There's just too many verbs in this one. When I first encountered these notes, all sharing this distinctive style, same script and ink used by a corrector who is active throughout the text, I assumed that the corrector had authored the notes. But this is probably not the case because some comments that surely originated with the same reader annotator are interpolated into the main text, like understand and beware, or contemplate exceedingly and make improvements. What this suggests is that this batch of comments from a reader who was prompted by the Soliloquia to generate these little moralizing pep talks was already present in one of the manuscripts antecedent to R. Other notes interpolated into the main text of R include an evaluation of Augustine's progress in the conversation. He questions slowly or with difficulty or with great effort. The words hic deest, which is standard textual corrector language to signal a lacuna in the text, has been mistakenly incorporated into the text. And here, the phrase a story or rhetorical subject that has been fabricated has been put in the main text. This was originally a paratextual elaboration on the genres of literature that commonly contain falsehoods. Taken as a group, the marginal and interpolated paratexts in R suggest a complicated history of responding to the Soliloquia through the lens of the discipline of grammatica in its broad sense, encompassing literary criticism, but also as a source of pastoral and moral reinforcement for a flagging spirit. Nothing in R suggests that its readers were engaging with the Soliloquia for the purpose of sharpening their skills in dialectic and abstruse philosophical inquiry. Our penultimate stop on this tour is manuscript PA, Paris BNF Latin 2697, copied in the 11th century at an unknown center on the continent. There's only one paratext in here that I want to call attention to. It doesn't have any marginal or interlinear glosses, but there's this little addition between the explicit of Book 1 and the incipit of Book 2. It's a quotation from Augustine's Confessions that reads, "Alas for me, I do not know even what it is that I do not know." Now, the reader who added this comment, whether it was directly to PA or to an antecedent copy, perceived the Soliloquia to be a dramatic representation of a man who struggles to the point of weeping to take in what he is taught by ratio. So this reader engaged with Augustine's dialogue on the personal and emotional level that Augustine consciously cultivates in his Confessions. Last but not least is Munich Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, CLM 14330, copied in the early or mid-11th century at St. Emmeram. A very engaged reader left his mark on this copy of the Soliloquia, mostly Book 1. He left several notae adjacent to the discussion of how the cultivation of the theological virtues sharpens the eyes of the mind, and one note that eloquently frames this process as the lex videndi, the law of seeing. Another cluster of marginal notes focuses on Augustine's struggles with desire. The marked passages are about the things Augustine most fears to lose: friends, life, health itself. About how marriage wrecks the intellectual vigor of the philosopher. About the most virtuous endeavor of abstaining from bodily pleasures. And about the hard truth that it's one thing for your desires to merely be asleep and another for them to have been extinguished completely. In a third cluster of notes, the reader is not so much signaling the memorable portions of the text, but he's offering his own subjective critiques and interpretations. And Ratio asks Augustine, "But what if your friends aren't interested in pursuing wisdom with you?" The marginal comment reads, "Cavillatur," either she's jesting or she's making fun of him. The reader records where someone has conceded a point thoughtlessly, temere, or spoken in truth, vere, or offered a really useful analogy, optima comparatio. And remember the unsavory aphorism that was borrowed from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations about how fools are like excrement? Here, that is attributed instead to the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, and it's called a stultus syllogismus, a stupid argument. This reader lavished most of his attention on Book 1. His only notes in Book 2 are efforts to identify two unnamed individuals as Ambrose and Alypius. He was probably right about Ambrose, but wrong about Alypius, and you guessed it, a nota monogram marking out the passage about the crocodile. Up to this point, I've spoken almost exclusively about annotations that are visibly marked as paratexts in the extant manuscripts. As we have seen, some of the extant manuscripts provide before and after snapshots that show the process of interpolation, like where the interlinear paratexts in J have been absorbed into the main text of BR, even though J is not the direct linear antecedent of BR. But interpolations can be detected even when the manuscripts that once marked them as paratexts don't survive. Spotting these interpolated glosses might seem like a trivial pursuit, but in the context of this study, they offer both quantitative and qualitative data to add to our understanding of readers' reception of the text. On the quantitative side, I've got two slides here that document the interpolation of mostly lexical and suppletive glosses. Notice in the left-hand column how many of our manuscripts have this sort of interpolation. Taken as a group, these add significantly to the weight of evidence that the practice of annotating the Soliloquia was more widespread than scholars have recognized, because every paratext that is now interpolated implies that at least one upstream codex contained the same information in an interlinear or marginal position. I've listed here the manuscripts that preserve these interpolations. 21 of the manuscripts considered here descend from manuscripts that have some degree of glossing and annotation going on in them. And this paints a radically different picture than we get from Pratt's claims about our glossed manuscript J being an outlier. I'd also like to propose something a little more conjectural and contentious, because I think it's worth thinking about quite apart from the Soliloquia. That is, we should probably expect that if a skilled scribe was using a clearly written exemplar, which is not always the case, but when this was the case, the rate at which he confused glosses with corrections ought to be quite low, and so the rate of interpolations ought to be quite low. And so it follows that some of these manuscripts that now transmit just a few interpolations descend from manuscripts that once had abundant interlinear and marginal annotations, most of which were subsequently not copied along with the main text. Interpolations also offer qualitative evidence, just like the visibly paratextual notes, of how early medieval readers responded to the Soliloquia. Multiple readers thought it was wise to mark which parts of the dialogue were reconsidered and amended by Augustine later on in his retractations, and the ones I've quoted here are all interpolated. We've already discussed the interpolations in manuscript R, which reflect an interest in grammatica, the other disciplines, moral exhortation. Those are here. And the interpolations in manuscript K reveal that students of a manuscript antecedent to K were focused on specialized philosophical topics, especially the nature of the human mind and soul. So there's two topical notae now interpolated that once helped a reader refer easily to passages about soul and body or about the soul's intellective faculty. And there's an interpolated gloss, ratio vel intentio, that must originally have been applied to mens in that same sentence. K also shares with manuscripts PA and BR a gloss about what exactly Augustine means when he says that evil is nothing. The blue box contains the interpolation, id est non substantiam habere, that is, that evil has no substance. Immediately following that one, the one that's underlined in red, is in K and PA, but not in BR. All things that God has made, even if they are changed into something worse by some opposition, are nonetheless perfect to their Maker, for whom their admirable beauty abides. Let me wrap this up. When we put all this data together, all the notes and all the interpolations, it yields some surprises. Audiences of the Soliloquia were in some instances reading for a philosophical understanding of truth and falsity, or of incorporeality and non-spatial distribution. This is especially true of the readers of manuscripts J and an antecedent to K, which have been associated with the schools of Laon and Soissons. Textual affiliations tell us that this may have been the milieu out of which English scholars inherited the Soliloquia in the late 9th or early 10th century. Whatever paratexts were applied in this philosophically minded milieu to the manuscript of the Soliloquia that crossed the Channel circa 900 would have strongly shaped English perceptions of what the Soliloquia was for, and thus influenced some scholars' decision to adapt the Latin work into Old English. But the paratexts gathered from across the early manuscripts of the Soliloquia also reveal a broad readership that brought a diverse array of concerns to their study of the text, Latin vocabulary and syntax, complex metaphors, allusions, and other literary devices, useful tidbits from other disciplines, including logic, geometry, and astronomy, guidance about cultivating virtue, sharpening the eyes of the mind, a model for those embracing the habits of asceticism, an opportunity to share in St. Augustine's own intellectual frustration and spiritual turmoil, and of course, perhaps the most enduring interest, crocodiles. To be able to fit all of these annotations in my paper today, I have left out two types of complementary evidence that I think we would need to really consider for a full grasp of early medieval reception. Borrowings from the Soliloquia in early medieval writings, including the ones we've already mentioned, but also some that had not been previously identified in the works of Sedulius Scotus, Gottschalk of Orbey, commentaries on Martianus Capella, and commentaries on Boethius. But far more people read the Soliloquia than wrote their own new texts. So I've really foregrounded the annotations today as a way to push back against the tendency to let borrowings dominate our perception of the reception of a text. As for the second kind of complementary evidence that I haven't adduced today, that would be the traveling companions of the Soliloquia in our extant manuscripts. This data is well known, it's easy to find, and so I haven't foregrounded it today. in very broad strokes, as a generalization, I see a trend in which the Soliloquia in the early 9th century manuscripts is supporting the study of the trivium, particularly grammatica, supporting Carolingian dialectics, incorporation of the Aristotelian categories. But as we get into the 10th and 11th centuries, we move toward a trend of compilation with texts that were primarily spiritual and pastoral, as in that manuscript BR, where we've got Crodegang's Rule for Canons and the homily on the purgatorial fire. Earlier I quoted David Pratt, where he draws a stark contrast between Augustine's Soliloquia and Boethius's Consolation on the grounds that the latter was a school text, but the Soliloquia was interesting only to a handful of people. Now that we've gotten a fuller example, or fuller picture of how readers in the 8th through 11th centuries responded to the Soliloquia, I'd like to close with a quote from a different study, this one by Malcolm Godden. Based on his extensive study of the glosses and commentary in early medieval manuscripts of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Godden observes, "As with most school texts, the glosses are of many different kinds. There are short glosses, often single words, that seem intended just to explain the meaning of words or perhaps the particular sense of multivalent words, or show how to construe a sentence. But there are also many longer glosses that take issue with the author's argument, or extrapolate it, or offer analogies, or provide the full story behind an allusion, or simply offer an etymology, or describe the figure of speech in use. They seem, that is, both to help the understanding of the text and to use it as a basis for accumulating knowledge of all kinds." Now, Godden made this statement about manuscripts of the Consolatio that had commentary in them, but I think it could just as easily be applied to the way scribes present Augustine's Soliloquia in manuscript J, or as readers responded to the Soliloquia across the more sparsely glossed early codices taken as a group. Obviously, Consolation would go on to become a work of central importance in the medieval curriculum, while Augustine's Soliloquia would wane in popularity, partly because its deployment of the Aristotelian categories would come to seem less relevant as other textbooks of dialectic eclipsed the categories in the 9th century among the Carolingians and in the 10th century among the English. But I suspect that a student of the Soliloquia in the mid-9th century, when the glossae collectae on the Consolation were just starting to come together, would not have made this distinction that we make in hindsight between the two texts. And our grasp of the reception of the Soliloquia can be improved by setting aside hindsight and letting the manuscripts tell us how early medieval readers really dialogued with the Soliloquia. Thank you.
We have time for about 15 minutes of questions, comments.
I've got one DM from Nicole Eddy.
Hi, Nicole.
Who said she wanted to congratulate you on a wonderful talk, and she was glad that we could do this live stream so that folks who couldn't be in person could attend. So.
Thank you. I realized that I need to repeat that, right? Because you're not on the microphone. So Megan was relaying a message from Medieval Institute alumna Nicole Eddy, who is now with the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library, just expressing some gratitude for the setup that allows so many people to participate. And I'm grateful that Nicole could be listening because I know she is an expert on paratextual annotations in medieval manuscripts. So thank you, Nicole, for being with us today. Please.
What initially drew you to this text in particular?
The question of what initially drew me to this text. The Latin or the Old English?
Both.
So the Old English, because of my earlier work, I mean, that's still really ongoing, but it came out of, came out of my dissertation here, which itself came out of a seminar paper that I was writing for Michael Lappage back in the day. I feel like it's okay to imbue a little bit of nostalgia into my responses in this particular audience, right? I was interested in whether we could better understand early medieval English concepts of the mind and its relationship to the soul and the body, because much of the Old English literature that's not translated directly from the Latin does not have a Platonist or an Augustinian understanding of what the mind is. It's a corporeal mind in the heart, mind in the chest. And I didn't know initially, but came to discover that the Old English Soliloquies is one of the most intriguing texts for tackling that question. And as I studied it, I started studying more about sort of the relationship between the Old English and the Latin, trying to figure out how in the world someone decided to make an Old English rendering of the Latin. And this is something I'll talk about more in the graduate seminar tomorrow. There is a critical edition of the Latin in the CSEL series, and so you think it's probably great, and it turns out it's not, and there's a lot of errors. So I started getting hold of manuscript pictures so I could check for textual variants in the early surviving manuscripts and see if any of those could be shown to be related to the lost Latin exemplar used by the translator of the Old English Soliloquies. So, did that make any sense or answer your question at all?
Absolutely.
Crocodiles. I'll just distract everybody. Any other questions, please?
Thank you again for this really detailed study. This is really cool. Do you think that other texts, maybe let's say being translated in the Alfredian court, or at least in the early medieval period, are coming into the canon, as it were, being translated and propagated more often when there are glosses like this of kind of an encyclopedic nature that don't have sort of one party line to take? I mean, that's a broad question, but do you think this kind of study can be expanded into like all of the Alfredian texts, maybe with the consolation accepted, and say, okay, this is an obscure text, but people could learn about crocodiles from it and learn about the nature of the soul. And those are both things that, kind of pass the text on into later medieval stuff.
Thank you for asking that. And again, I have to repeat the question because you're not picked up on the mic. Tell me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, but the question is really about, is there a reason to think that this method could be expanded to other texts that were translated into Old English? That is, was the decision to translate influenced by the presence of this wide array of glosses? And we just haven't really discovered that yet. Now, you mentioned the consolation of philosophy. Of course, we know that there's this huge body of gloss material that we are still waiting on publication of, right? Like the Boethius in Early Medieval Europe project has all the stuff, and they are slowly creeping toward publication of the massive amount of early medieval glosses on that. People who've studied the images of manuscripts and studied the manuscripts in situ have published little bits and pieces, so some of that is available to all of us. And the exciting thing is that more and more of it is available to all of us as more and more manuscripts go online. So we can start to see more about the content of the glosses that most likely influence the decision to translate the consolation into Old English. With respect to, say, the other Alfredian texts, we certainly have lots of psalm glosses, and there is kind of a big industry of comparing the Alfredian psalms with the known glossed psalters from early medieval England. And as for the pastoral care, I don't actually know what the glossing situation is like. And the person who did the most, one of the scholars who's done the most work on the relationship between the Old English pastoral care and the extant manuscripts, Richard Clement, published a study in 1985 that deals with that doesn't treat glosses whatsoever, as far as I know. I don't know that any of those manuscripts are actually glossed, so that's sort of an out there question. I think it would be really good if this method were just taken on a little bit more often, because one other place where I've seen this interaction between paratextual treatment of Latin texts and influence on Old English texts is in, this is also obscure, the doctrinal poems of Prudentius, so not his very well-known Psychomachia or the liturgically important hymns or even the saints' lives, but the Apotheosis and Hamartigania, the one about the divinity of Christ, So it's about early medieval or late antique heresies, Christological heresies, and hamartigania on the origin of sin. I do think that the glossing and the sort of other apparatus, like pointing out, oh, this section of the hamartigania is sort of a standalone prayer. That stuff I do think influenced early medieval English readers to excerpt, and I'm still working on an argument that influenced Kinewolf and other poets to absorb some of that into their writing. But that's sort of a not finished project, so I'm floating that out there, but I can't give you tons of detail. Did that answer your question?
It did.
At more length than you wanted?
Thank you.
Sure, please.
So thank you so much for this talk. You mentioned traveling companions
Yes.
for the Soliloquia, and I wondered if you found similar patterns of glossing in those traveling companions, if you looked at them at all, if there's some of the same hands, different hands, similar errors in copying, if you could speak to that at all.
I haven't had access to all of them equally. And this is something I'll talk about in the graduate seminar tomorrow. Manuscript B and manuscript BR, I've spent time with these in person. And others are now free online, so we can see all of them. But others of them, so far I'm still working with images that I've ordered of just the Soliloquia or the things that are immediately on each side of it. So I can't pretend to give you a full answer, and I just realized I totally forgot to repeat your question into the microphone. The question was about the traveling companions of the Soliloquia and what we can say about readerly treatments of those things. In the case of Rothair, he annotated the entirety of manuscript T. In the case of manuscript BR, we do have Old English and Latin glosses on Crodegong's rule, which is really interesting. I think there are connections between the Old English soliloquies and the packaging of those two texts together. And when we think about audience, when we think about some distinctive vocabulary. But it's not a question that I can give a thorough answer to. I will say in manuscript J, there is similar glossing applied to the text that immediately follows the Soliloquia, which is De Immortalitate Anime, or it's De Quantitate. I can't remember now which one in J, but it's one of his other two early dialogues on the soul that has a lot of the same subject matter. So that reinforces the impression that manuscript J was using this as an entree into, I guess, to see how to apply the kind of reasoning that the whole Munich Passages sort of group of texts was applying. But also in manuscript J, we end up with Latin poetry toward the end. So it's not purely about dialectica, it's also about grammatica. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Calvin, please.
Somewhere in my mind, there's a question about stemata. Given my experience in editing Boethius glosses on the Musica and what you've said today, glossing traditions are not subjective writings in the margins, they are textual traditions. Mm-hmm. And you posit this exemplar for J. It seems to be impossible to reduce this to a stemma in any sort of traditional way. Mm-hmm. And I'm constantly coming up with the question, how do they relate? Mm-hmm. How did the manuscripts get from one place to the other? Mm-hmm. Did they have more than one manuscript in front of them when they were doing this text? Yeah. What do you imagine with respect to this very vague question?
Yeah, the question that Calvin posed was about stematic relations. What can we even begin to do with a stematic conceptualization of how the glosses got from one place to another? With the main text of the Soliloquia, the textual tradition is so contaminated that the editor, Wolfgang Hermann, in the CSEL, and this is an edition that came out in 1986, he threw up his hands and said, we can't do it. We can't do a stemma because manuscripts crossed paths so often and were so quickly collated against one another after copying that all of the lines of transmission are contaminated. Buot takes him to task for giving up a little bit too easily. You can discern families. Hermann didn't consider our manuscript BR, but he puts J in a group with G, W, and O. K sometimes goes along with it, but K is a mess. Lots and lots of errors in the main text. And so it's interesting to me that we've got these couple of very tenuous links between its paratexts and the Old English tradition, because the main text affiliation between K and the Old English tradition almost non-existent. And then one category of paratext that I had to leave out today is after collation, people would add those vel glosses with alternative readings, right? Those are very frequent in manuscripts J and C. There's a few in BR. There's only a smattering elsewhere. But the presence of those vel glosses that give the alternative readings completely, it shows you, well, gosh, someone who copied this next had to make the choice. Do I reproduce the vel gloss, or which of these variant readings do I choose? I think actually the Old English translator, when he was faced with vel glosses, he sometimes translated both. There's a spot where there's an ostendi, vel ostendisti in manuscript G, I think it is. It doesn't occur there in manuscript J, but the Old English has something along the lines of, well, you've shown me, and I've shown you, reflecting exactly this sort of doubt about which reading is right that's presented by the main text and the vel gloss.
And there are more vel glosses than almost anything else.
In C, yes. Not in J.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they become text.
They do become text. Yes, you're absolutely right. So I wish that I could do more with the stemma of even just the main text. But I think if the author of the critical edition and Buot are saying, no, it's too contaminated, then I've got to throw up my hands to some extent. But I have drawn a stemma that has lots of diagonal and dotted lines trying to show collations.
When Michael and I were working on the Boethius glosses, trying to draw up a stemma, Bishop came in to date a manuscript for us, and he said, oh, I don't do that anymore.
Must be nice. Thank you for your question, Calvin. Others? Any coming in on YouTube? I'm curious. What's the reader reception on YouTube like?
We've had a nice run. We've had, I think, up to 12 viewers, which is great.
Good,
But
good.
They're so, they're digesting.
There's a lot to digest. And we know they're moving their lower jaw, not their upper jaw, as they're chewing on what I've said. I'm sorry, I'm just obsessed with the fact that they're all interested in crocodiles. Any other questions? I want to thank you all for your patience with my long paper and lots of pictures. It was just such a privilege to be back here and presenting this research here to a community that I care about and feel so strongly that I got great formation here. So thank you for your attention and your questions.
Well, thank you